Hello, welcome. I'm Luke Darracott of Madrid and Darracott, and I wanted to do a quick video focusing on what I think is the best wine in the world, and because I've said that, you know it's true. Today I want to do a quick little guide through the wonderful world of sherry, and sherry is probably the most misunderstood, misdiagnosed, underknown, and maybe even just unknown drink we have in Spain. On one hand, people go, oh yeah, I know the word sherry. So you think, oh, sherry is a known drink. But people tend to think it's that sweet stuff that my grandma drinks at Christmas, which it can be. However, there's a whole world of sherries, from the driest wines in the world to the sweetest wines in the world. So on this video, I want to do a quick whip through of all of the styles, because if you're not drinking it right now, you've really screwed up. So, before we get into the drinks, quick bit of history. Proper 2 minutes, if that. First of all, wine. We have the Phoenicians to thank. About 3,000 years ago, the Phoenicians bring wines to the south of Spain, and they start to flourish. The Romans then expand it, etc. Then we can thank the Moors, who in the 800s, the early part of the last millennia, they started to bring in the idea of distillation. Now this is important because sherry, God love it, is what we call a fortified wine. So there's extra booze in all of these wines. The same thing you find in port wine that's fortified. Now, we wouldn't have had that fortification if it wasn't for the Moors. Sherry then had a boom in the 1400s, 1500s. Shakespeare wrote about sherry. They called it sack back then. Back then it was probably very sweet and very alcoholic. And it probably did not use the process by which we currently make modern sherries. Sherry, as we know it today, really had its boom time again 1700s, 1800s. It was the drink. Everyone drank it, especially the Brits. Now, there are sweet sherries, and sugar helped in the exporting of this, what is, as you'll find out, a white wine all around the continent and the rest of the world. However, in Spain, most of the sherry that we drink is dry. So, God's sake, shut up, Luke, and have a drink. What are the main styles? So, we're going to start with a glass of Fino. You may have heard of the word Fino. You will probably have heard of the most... Oh, I will be drinking all these, by the way. You'll probably hear people talk about the famous Tío Pepe. If you come to Madrid, you will go to the main square and you will see a big neon sign that says Tío Pepe and a little bottle of that famous green-glassed Fino lit up at night. Before we start making any of these wines, we have to say where it's from, what is the grape, because these ones we're going to try, apart from the sweet ones at the end, are all the same grape, and what is important about this part. All sherry wine has to come from what they call vaguely the sherry triangle. It's not really a perfect triangle, which is down, if you go to Seville and south, you'll find a city called Cádiz, which is beautiful. And there are these three towns: Jerez, which the old name was during the Moorish eras Xeres, which became Sherry in English, and Jerez in Spanish. Jerez, which is inland, and then there's 2 points on the coast, kind of equidistant from each other, which you have Sanlúcar de Barrameda, more on that later, and El Puerto de Santa Maria. So your wine has to come from there. Rioja wine has to come from Rioja. Champagne, fun fact, has to come from Champagne. Jerez wines, sherry wines, have to come from this area near Jerez. The soil down there, it's quite a hot, quite humid at times, but quite a hot part of the country. You do get rains, but big rains, either ends of the year, but not generally through summer. So what you have is this very pale, almost reflective soil called albariza. Alba meaning white in the old Latin, which I'm sure we all speak. This soil has a very high chalk content. What that means is it acts like a big old sponge in those hot months, which thus making it easier to grow your grapes. And what is the grape? I hear you all cry. Well, this is not Albarino or Verdejo. This is not the land of Tempranillo or Garnacha. This is one of the most important grapes in Spanish history, but kind of has been hiding behind the facade of this is how a sherry is made, which is the grape Palomino Fino. Interestingly enough, the same word, Fino. Palomino inherently, I don't want to insult anyone or anything, it's not the most interesting grape by itself, but if you want to sound pretentious, which I always do, because of that sort of delicate neutrality, it acts like this blank canvas upon which the winemakers can work. So what you do is you make white wine from Palomino, 11%, 12% alcohol, whatever you want to do. Then you fortify it by adding this distilled grape spirit, literally just clear alcohol obtained from grape. Same thing you use to make brandy, for example. And you leave it there for some months, so it all intermingles. And then this is where the winemakers would destine the wines to become Fino styles, or, as we'll see later, Oloroso styles. Ergo, we come to the Fino. You can see it's a white wine. You can see the colour there. This is a white wine. 15% alcohol. This is the Bertola Fino from Diez Merito, one of the great wineries down there. What you do is you fortify your wine to 15%. Then you put it in a barrel. And the barrels, you never fully fill. You always leave what they call two fists, dos puños. You leave a space at the top of that barrel. Now, because down here it's quite humid, and you have the presence of oxygen in each barrel, this layer of yeast, which doesn't look very nice, it looks like wet bread or something. This layer of yeast grows inside every barrel, just on the top of the exposed wine. And they call it la flor, the flower. So it's very beautiful. They talk about how the la flor enflorece, the flower blooms over the wine. It looks gross, but it's very important. That will protect Fino from oxidizing. That's why it's still a white wine. Yes, it's got a bit golden, because there are, some years into making a Fino. Your average Fino, well, it can be aged for 2 years in these barrels, but generally most people do 3 or more. So it will get a bit of a golden colour, but it still remains a white wine. But when you smell it, you get all that yeasty, bready pungency. Also, famously, these kind of white nuts like almonds kind of thing as well. You smell what you smell. That's the first step, a fortified white wine under this layer of yeast. And they call this biological aging, because it's literally having a biological impact on the wine, this yeast. Now, that's the first part. That's the easy bit. Time to get more complicated. Imagine a big bodega, a big winery room, and you have a layer of 10 barrels, okay? And then you have another layer, and then you have 5 layers of 10 barrels, okay? This is where you get this, what they call fractional blending process. You're going to be blending from barrels to barrels here. Very complicated, but we'll keep it simple for this, because I don't want you to turn off and go and watch people making videos of cats. The wine that you are going to put into a bottle that year, you take from the very bottom layer. Now, the system of barrels is called the Solera system. And just to confuse everybody, the bottom layer is also called the Solera layer, because Solera comes from the word suelo, which means ground in Spanish. So, anyway, from the very bottom layer, you empty some of the wine out to be bottled. But you have to leave about a third left in the barrel. And remember, there was already a space in that barrel. So if you want to keep it very, very basic, you could imagine basically, although it's not perfect, imagine you have the thirds. There's a third free for the oxygen. You've taken out a third and you've left a third. What that means is you need to fill up that bottom layer. Then you go to the next layer. And they call that the first nursery, la primera criadera. And then you take a third down. But then you're missing a third in that layer. So then you go to the next layer and take a third down. And the next one, and the next one. You keep blending out of the bottom, in at the top, until you get to the newest layer. And that is where your new wine, the wine that you made that year, the normal young white wine, just fortified, goes in. They call that the mosto yema. So the new wine in at the top, and the wine to be bottled out of the bottom. What that means is, this is not a vintage wine. This is not the, I'm drinking the 1985. There are some very rare vintage sherries, and they are special. They're not cheap. But generally speaking, this is a blended wine, like champagne. It's multiple vintages. And what that also means is, because you never empty a barrel, as long as that system has been intact 50 years, 100 years, 200 years, by absolute definition of maths, you will have some molecules of wine in there from maybe a century or two ago. So for me, it's a very romantic wine. You're really drinking history. Most Finos, you're not looking for this old stuff. So most Finos, let's say, will end up passing through the system in 3, 4, 5 years. And you have a white wine, It's got a kick to it. And it has a little a retrogusto, a back taste, an aftertaste of that kind of nuttiness, a yeastiness, kind of a bready note. But it's fresh, it's dry, it's light. Fino and Manzanilla, which is a style of Fino, which I'll talk about now, are the driest styles of wine, almost some of the driest wines in the world. This could not be more far removed from the idea of sherry that we have in England and America, maybe, of this sweet stuff. I took a bottle of this to my grandma, not this particular, I took Tio Pepe to my grandma a few years ago, and she loves a sherry. Harvey's Bristol cream, she loves a sherry before Christmas lunch, and I gave her a big fat glass of the Spanish stuff, and she looked at me with a face of horror, like, et tu, Brutus? And I was like, don't you like it? And my grandma said the mythical line, that's not sherry, sherry is sweet. Which is completely wrong. I love you, Grandma, but that's really wrong. This is sherry. Sherry can be sweet. More on that later. So this is the Fino. White wine, Palomino, fortified and aged in this blended barrel system called the Solera system for X number of years. Again, it's the choice of the winemaker. But the key is under this layer of yeast, protective film of yeast called La Flor, the flower. So that's the Fino. Next, Manzanilla. Now this is La Gitana. La Gitana is a mythical winery in the town of Sanlúcar de Barrameda, which is also one of my favorite places in the world. Great tapas, just adorable little town on the sea. Literally the other side of the water is a national park with flamingos and stuff. Manzanilla wines. Manzanilla comes from the word chamomile. So there's we don't know if it's true or not, but there's a story that the word Manzanilla for the wine comes from the fact that you might be smelling a kind of chamomile-ness in the aromas. Who knows, who cares? It's also a type of olive. It also means small apple. So it's a very confusing word. When you're ordering Manzanilla, make sure you specify what type of Manzanilla you want. But anyway, by law it has to come from the town of Sanlúcar. Now it is a Fino, by definition of how it's made. Same process as before. White wine, under yeast, blended. So that's exactly the same. However, the difference is, in Jerez and in more interior towns and stuff, imagine my hand is the layer of yeast for the Fino. In winter and in summer, you might get little tiny cracks appearing in the layer. Just little ones. So this is not an oxidized wine, the Fino, but there will be moments where a little bit of oxygen can intercede and affect the process. Okay, so what? Well, in Manzanilla, the layer is super thick. Sanlúcar is much more humid, gets much more affected by the sea air compared to the other regions. So what that means is oxygen will never basically come in contact with the wine. That's protected by this layer of yeast. So it's the lightest styles you can get is Manzanilla. They're the most approximate to a white wine. So if I have people who don't like sherry, you either ease them in very gently with something sweet, but then that gives them a false idea of what sherry is. You can go to an Oloroso, more on that later, or, especially if they like white wine, I tend to give them a Manzanilla because it's bright, it's fresh. They say that you can smell a certain touch of the sea air to it. That might be poetic thinking, but it is lighter, it is brighter and breezier, we could say. This one particular, the reason I like to put this on our tastings is it's the Manzanilla en rama. Now this is a fairly new idea. If you are a winemaker and you have your big barrels, if you're going to bottle it for sale to shops and bars and stuff, you're probably going to want to make sure it's not full of gunk, particles, bits of yeast or whatever. Fine. En rama is the new marketing term for unfiltered, fresh out the butt, botas they call them, fresh out the barrel sherry. So with this one, you're really getting the freshest, cleanest, brightest style of Manzanilla. I absolutely love it because it, in your head and in the glass, it's recreating what it could be like to be there in the winery and just having a bit straight from the barrel. By the way, if you see images of sherry makers and sherry professionals, the way they test the Manzanillas and the Finos, because it's covered in yeast, right? You don't just go in with a glass. They have this long metal sort of tube, and at the bottom of it is a small little metal cup, and you dunk the cup straight through the layer of the yeast, and you take it straight out of that same hole, and then you'll pour it from a height into the glass. That long thing is called a Venencia, which is also the name of my favourite bar in Madrid. But anyway, that would be, in theory, an Enrama style of sherry. So, that's Manzanilla, a very bright, breezy style of Fino. Oh yeah, that's so good. Now, third style, and make sure I don't get too drunk here. Third style, we're going to have one from a chap called Manuel Aragon, who was actually just outside the triangle, sort of further east down the coast in a town called Chiclana, famous for sort of holiday makers, long, white, sandy beaches. Amontillado. Some of you may know the Edgar Allan Poe story, the cask of Amontillado, or Amontillado, as we erroneously say it in English. Amontillado. Now, Montilla Moriles is another region further inland towards Cordoba, where they make similar styles of wines, but with the great Pedro Jimenez. They tend to be rougher, more rustic, and they tend to be more oxidatively aged, browner styles. So Amontillado means similar style to a Montilla, Amontillado, like a Montilla-ified style, because these are brown, as you'll see from the colour. You've got kind of a golden brown colour there. So, what's going on? Amontillado will always start its life as a Fino or a Manzanilla. And when it occurs, it can either be naturally forming Amontillado, or, more likely for most normal wineries, you create an Amontillado. Yeast will die after maybe 6, 7, 8 years, naturally. Even though you're changing from barrels to barrels and replenishing nutrients every time you move wine from one to another, it will still eventually just conk out. Or, what is more normal, if you just increase the alcohol, to this case 18%, it will kill the yeast. Yeast will die after about 16.5%. So either way, if you're killing it, or if it just disappears, what happens is then your Fino or your Manzanilla, whether it's been there for 3 years, 2 years, 5 years, whatever, is suddenly now exposed to the elements, exposed to oxygen, which is, for this thing, good, because then it'll start oxidizing. The same thing a whiskey. A whiskey starts life as a clear alcohol and turns brown. So does our white wine, which is what it is, Manzanilla or Fino, start to turn brown. And with it come all of the super inviting notes of oxidation in wines. Nuts, caramel, they call them frutos secos, dried nuts. You can imagine all these dried salty nuts, in a bowl, that kind of vibe. But there is still something else underneath all of that, because it has had a previous life with this biological aging and has continued its life oxidative aging. So Amontillados, by their very definition, should be some of the most, if not the most, complex styles of sherry, purely because they've had these two ways of aging, and purely because they will be older. Finos, you can get old Finos, but usually they're younger than an Amontillado, because Amontillado has started as a Fino and continued into becoming an Amontillado. There is an intermediary style where Finos and Manzanillas are on the cusp of tiptoeing towards being an Amontillado, which is called Fino or Manzanilla Pasado or Pasada, like past it, which doesn't sound too good. But basically Amontillado is very rich, very complex, and very full. And this is the style which got me into sherry in the first place. So if you want to try something quite complex, Amontillado. So remember at the start I said wines are either destined to becoming Fino styles or Oloroso styles. So we have our Fino and our Manzanilla, and maybe we let that continue to becoming an Amontillado. Or maybe way back when we're looking at our young white wine, maybe the wine isn't light enough or elegant enough or crisp enough to warrant making an elegant, delicate Fino or Manzanilla. So we think, this wine's a little bit more rustic, a bit less graceful. Let's make an Oloroso. I just realised I didn't have a sip of my Amontillado. Hang on. Woo! This afternoon's going to be fun at work. So, Oloroso. I've gone for González Bias. Now, González Bias make Tío Pepe, the most textbook benchmark style of Fino. They have the whole range. And their Oloroso, you see it's a similar colour. This is not a super old one. It's a similar colour to the Amontillado, but a little bit darker. The Oloroso is a little bit darker. Now, Oloroso, which means smelly, or if you want to be more poetic, aromatic, is just that. I've got my wine. I think this is going to become an Oloroso. We can forget about yeast this time, because I'm going to immediately fortify that wine to about 17.5%, 18%. So the yeast is like, nah. If we touch that wine, we're going to die. So this never gets a layer of yeast. So from day one, the wines destined to become Olorosos immediately start to oxidize. Hence the darker color. Hence the aromas of... You get those nuts again, you get the caramel, but now we're veering towards an almost sweetness. You're going to get toffee. Caramel, like something almost, you could have it as a dessert. But in the mouth... Ooh, it's full, it's creamy, not sticky creamy, but like alcoholic, glycerolic creamy. But it's dry. It's bone dry. There's still no sugar here. These are still dry wines. And you get a lovely caramel nut back taste after you've swallowed it. Oloroso, even though it's the most alcoholic of the, well, jointly with Amontillado, but even though it's the most alcoholic of the base styles, it's perhaps the most forgiving, because it is a dry wine, but it mimics those nutty sweet notes, and it's, I don't know, it's very very pleasing. I suppose you could just say very pleasing. That's all it has for that, though. So you have Finos and Manzanillas and Amontillados. Oloroso is its own separate entity. Now, there is one style you might see, Palo Cortado, my label's coming off there, Palo Cortado, which sits about there. Palo Cortado is as annoying as it is amazing, as mysterious as it is tasty. There are documentaries made about this one wine. I love it. It's more expensive. If you find a cheap Palo Cortado, it's not a real Palo Cortado. Let's keep it simple. Maybe I'm making a Fino. And probably, because it's my Fino, after 3 or 4 years, I may then say, let's continue and make an Amontillado, alcohol, increase that, kill the yeast, starts oxidizing, Amontillado. Cool. Imagine after 2 years, or even less, something happens to the yeast, unplanned, and it dies. What? That wasn't part of the plan. And then it starts oxidizing, but the resulting wine is amazing. Now, Palo Cortado is not a registered method. Palo Cortado, of all these wines, is the only one which is analyzed by how it smells and how it tastes by a group of experts, which is very weird. So really, you shouldn't, I mean, you can, but you shouldn't really be creating a Palo Cortado in a definite sense. It should be something which majestically just appears, but people still make it. As far as my tiny brain can understand, to try and keep it simple for you guys, it seems to be, you have a Fino, which or a Manzanilla, which, by the way, remember, is the most elegant of the white wines that you start with, who loses the yeast and therefore oxidizes for longer than if you were going to make an Amontillado, right? So it's kind of overcompensated. Your Fino for 3 years and then Amontillado for 3 years. But this one, it's done Fino for 1.5 years or 2, but then it's done 4.5 years of oxidizing. So what you tend to get with Palos is the delicacy and elegance of maybe an Amontillado made from a Fino, but the more robust oxidative notes and richness of an Oloroso. They are delicious, but they can be eye-wateringly expensive. So if you can't afford a Palo Cortado, you'll be fine with Amontillado and Oloroso. Heavens knows I am. Now, those are the dry styles. That is the lion's share of what we drink in Spain. Day to day, in the bars, maybe less in Madrid, but if you go south, We don't order, can I have a vino de Jerez? No, you order a Fino or a Manzanilla if you're having fish and tapas and fried shrimp fritters and Russian salad. I'm having meatballs and oxtail. I'm having meat stews. Give me an Amontillado. Give me a Palo Cortado. Give me an Oloroso. We need to start loving these wines and understanding these wines by the style and not thinking of them as sherry and that's it. Having said that, we do have sweet styles here. One example here, I've gone for the Álvaro Domecq Viña 98, which is a wine called Pedro Jiménez. This is my mum's favourite. I don't know if you can see. It's very dark, it's black. You can see how gloopy it is. How it clings to the glass. We have another one here as well. Let me just lean over. Moscatel. There are two grapes which we use to make sweet wines. Palomino, always dry. Pedro Jiménez, and to a far lesser extent, Moscatel, we use to make sweet sherry wines. The sweetest wines in the world sometimes. What you do is you take your grape, in this case either Pedro Jiménez or PX for short, or Moscatel, and you dry them under the sun on these open mats. So what happens when you dry out grapes? You get raisins. Then you make wine come out of those raisins, and that juice is going to be sticky and sweet. Then you fortify it, and then you pass it through the Solera system. So this is a fractionally blended, fortified raisin wine. And when you smell them, Moscatel tends to be a bit more delicate, but Pedro Jiménez, woo! Prunes, dates, like sticky figs. It smells of Christmas. Some bit of spice in there as well. And then, whoa, woo! It's boozy, but not noticeably alcoholic. And it covers the mouth. It's creamy. It's salacious. It's a filthy, luscious wine. One glass and you're probably okay. But this, I mean, at Christmas, if you have in Britain, for example, Christmas pudding and a glass of this, your head's going to explode. You'll probably get diabetes immediately. So when someone says, I don't like sherry because it's sweet, well, no, it's not always. Or if someone says, oh, I find Fino too dry, what about these ones? Or when someone says, what is sherry? You can understand why it can be complicated to transmit this information. Sherry is a family of wines. On the dry side, all made by the grape Palomino, and it's an interplay with alcohol and the air. Either it's 15% or so Fino Manzanilla under yeast, or it's that wine increased to 18% and then oxidizing, Amontillado or Palo Cortado maybe, or your wine was 18% before it even started its life and was just oxidizing, and that's Oloroso. Or maybe you sun-dried some grapes and made Pedro Jiménez and Moscatel fortified sweet sherries. Sherry for me is a whole tapestry of wine. It is the most versatile of wines because it isn't one wine. You can do a whole meal with sherries. You will be absolutely pissed by the end. But for me, it's a drink that should be celebrated. It's romantic. It's all of Andalusia. When I drink sherry, I think of flamenco, these tiny bars which just serve like chicharrones and cured cheese, and they write your order on the wooden, counters in chalk. It's sunshine. It's annoyingly attractive people. It's white towns. It's siesta, fiesta, bullfighting, whatever. For me, and I've said this before, and I hate myself when I say it, but it is alchemy in a glass. And once you understand what is going on, it really makes every style that much more pleasurable. So, get to your local supermarket. There's no such thing as a bad sherry. By the way it's made, there's no bad sherry. And see if you can find these styles. Just look for the words Fino. Look for the words Manzanilla, and make sure it has the stamp at the bottom. Sherry is Spain, and it is the best wine in the world.